The wet lie, 1922's baseline error. They met on a cold November in Santa Fe with a task that sounded simple: divide a river. Herbert Hoover kept the peace as chair, but peace had a price. The Bureau's flow records, short, shiny, and conveniently plump, told a flattering story. The Colorado, they said, averaged more than 15 million acre-feet. On that ledger, dreamers could build anything. The problem was timing. The gauges sang during one of the wettest stretches in a millennium. Tree rings, silent then, deafening now, show those decades were an outlier. The long-run river gave closer to 12 million acre-feet, but nobody in that room wanted to hear it. California was sprinting. The other 6 states were tying their shoes while eyeing the starting gun. The stakes felt immediate. If California locked up rights first, the upper basin feared a dry future and political irrelevance. So negotiators split the river cleanly on paper: 7.5 million acre-feet to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower. Mexico's share, 1.5, would come later. Add it up, and the math only works if the river behaves like the wet years. It didn't. They wrote a contract against a phantom. Hoover pushed compromise over caution. Engineers warned about variability, but precision lost to urgency. The compact ducked the hardest question: who takes the hit when the river's smaller than the promise, and left that to future lawyers. In that ambiguity, incentives took shape: build fast, grow faster, and let the next drought balance the books. Meanwhile, the political theater sharpened the divide. Upper basin states insisted on protecting their right to develop later without being trapped by California's head start. Lower basin cities, Los Angeles, then a booming Phoenix and San Diego, saw a clean number, not a shifting climate engine. Agricultural empires in Imperial and Palo Verde were already laying canals like arteries. The message was clear: convert paper water into wet water before the other guy does. Here's the number that haunted the century: a guarantee north of 15 against a reality near 12, sometimes less. That gap, 3 million acre-feet, became the hidden debt in every budget, every dam bond, every subdivision promise stamped with assured supply. People lived on that number, banks lent on it, politicians campaigned on it, and each good snow year let them believe a little longer. There was one data set that would have slowed the parade. Paleoclimate work, tree rings carving out droughts deeper than anyone remembered, started to emerge decades later. But even in the mid-20th century, early hydrographs hinted at trouble. Variability wasn't a nuisance, it was the plot. The compact, though codified optimism. Once you pour optimism into law, you pour it into concrete next. From the minute the ink dried, the race shifted to construction. The Bureau of Reclamation would make the flows bankable. Storage could smooth the bad years, they argued, and hydropower could pay the bills. On a spreadsheet, it looked like securitization. Take volatile water, wrap it in reservoirs, sell bonds against steady deliveries and electrons. The law's generous baseline became collateral. But the incentives hid a trap. If your legal promise exceeds your physical supply, growth looks heroic while reservoirs are full. As they drop, the math you ignored shows up with a clipboard. Meanwhile, politics hardened. Prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, meant early agricultural users held senior claims. New metro giants arrived late and junior, yet carried outsized populations and economies. The compact didn't erase that, it layered over it. In quiet memos, a few engineers admitted the baseline was probably high. They proposed clauses to adjust deliveries to actual supply. Those clauses didn't survive. Too messy for lawyers, too scary for bond markets, too soon to confront. So the system adopted a workaround mentality: over-allocate, then negotiate exceptions whenever reservoirs sag. It worked, until the 21st century took away the cushion. What nobody in 1922 knew, what they couldn't know, was that warming would shave the river even in years with decent snow. Warmer air steals moisture from soil and plants before it becomes runoff. Earlier melt slips past the capture window. Evaporation climbs off big lake surfaces. The river didn't just dip, it changed character. The average vanished from under the compact's feet. Meanwhile, the cultures built on the promise found momentum hard to break. Farm districts structured around cheap, senior water kept planting thirsty crops that paid the bills. Cities wrote 100-year assured supply letters while adding rooftops faster than they cut per capita use. Hydropower revenues papered over irrigation deals and subsidized growth. Everyone's ledger balanced as long as the old snowpack returned. There's a micro-story that captures the blind spot. In the 1950s, a bureau engineer visiting a river gauge wrote a note about missing flow during hot springs, the water s in the wind. He wasn't being poetic. He was watching future debt drift off the surface. That line never made it into the compact. It should have been the headline. So the wet lie did its quiet work. It wasn't fraud. It was a bet, placed with the confidence of a young century in love with machines and maps. The check they wrote bought time, power, and cities. It also set up a reckoning. Promises on paper were about to become concrete, miles of it, and that concrete would double as collateral for a river that was never that big. Concrete as collateral, Hoover, Glen Canyon, and the engineered empire. To turn a paper promise into power, they poured mountains into forms. Hoover Dam rose first, the Depression's cathedral of concrete. It caught the river in a blue fist called Lake Mead and sold the captured future as bonds and kilowatts. Glen Canyon followed, quieter but just as ambitious, stacking sandstone walls into Glen Canyon Dam and inflating Lake Powell behind it. Together, the two lakes could hold almost 4 years of the river's flow, enough, they said, to flatten chaos into a schedule. This was securitization in hard hats. Take volatile water, store it, then sell certainty. Hydropower contracts became cash flow streams, underwriting irrigation projects and urban pipelines. The Bureau didn't just build dams, it minted financial instruments. Power revenues backstopped canals like the All-American and Central Arizona project, which in turn validated new suburbs and fields. The river became an income statement, and concrete was the collateral. For half a century, storage masked the gap between promise and reality. Big winters refilled deficits, and the lakes acted like a revolving line of credit. The more dependable the graph looked, the more everyone borrowed against it. Cities pegged growth to deliveries that assumed those lakes wouldn't blink. Farm districts signed 40-year contracts at prices that only made sense if the turbines kept spinning. Inside that elegance hid a slow bleed. Evaporation and seepage carved away at the margin every hour the sun was up. At Mead and Powell, wide surfaces turned water into vapor and losses into normal. Sediment settled to the bottoms like a quiet mortgage payment you never see, shrinking future capacity grain by grain. None of it was priced into the dream, all of it was real. A farmer in Yuma opened his electric bill in 1973 and smiled. Hydropower from Hoover kept the pumps cheap. He irrigated alfalfa that week, water shimmering over furrows under desert heat. Miles away, that same river, pressed through turbines, was offsetting the cost that made his crop possible. The loop felt efficient. It was also cannibalistic. Every kilowatt paid for more delivery that demanded more storage, that lost more to the sky. Meanwhile, power contracts created political armor. Millions of people plugged into electrons born of falling water. Municipal utilities came to treat Glen and Hoover as baseload, steady, dependable, always there when the grid hummed at dinner time. Ratepayers far from the river built their budgets around cheap hydro. That made the lakes more than reservoirs. They were obligations to households that never saw a canal. Engineers read the ledger differently. They watched the head, the vertical drop that makes electricity shrink as reservoirs fell. Less head meant fewer megawatts per cubic foot. Below certain elevations, cavitation chewed at turbine blades, and minimum power pools moved from theoretical to looming. Retrofits bought a few feet, maybe a few years, but not a new physics. As levels dipped, hydropower revenue slid first, then reliability. There were warning memos about sediment load trapping in Lake Powell and Mead's bathtub rings rising. They recommended sediment bypass studies and reoperations to pulse high flows for beaches and ecology. Some experiments worked for habitat, none added water to the books. The dams had stabilized a river, but also starved it of sediment downstream, changing beaches, fish, and culture in the canyon. Stability had an ecological price, paid in sand and temperature. Finance didn't miss the upside. Bond markets loved the predictability of power sales, and irrigation districts floated debt on the assumption of continued generation. The Bureau packaged certainty, investors bought it. The federal government's full faith and credit hovered in the background, but the real guarantor was snowpack turned into head. When the snow thinned, the bonds didn't. They just carried more risk than the prospectus admitted. As cities grew, those hydropower dollars cross-subsidized deliveries that allowed lawns to creep into places where saguaros used to stand. In the policy language, hydropower paid for water development. In practice, it hid the true cost of pushing a river uphill to meet land use decisions. Cheap power made marginal water look affordable. Then demand outpaced snow. The lakes became less a buffer and more a scoreboard. Keeping turbines spinning required release patterns that sometimes favored head over storage, short-term electrons over long-term security. Emergency equalization between Powell and Mead turned into accounting maneuvers to protect minimum power pools. Each move revealed the trap: 2 dams, 1 river, and a century's worth of commitments stacked on a declining baseline. The bathtub rings on Mead and Powell turned into a ledger you didn't need spreadsheets to read. Every white stripe marked a year of debt not repaid by runoff. Marina owners tracked their docks with headaches and rope. Hydropower operators tracked their head with sleepless math. The system could still function until it couldn't. At some threshold, baseload becomes liability, and the cash register that funded the empire coughs. The engineered empire wasn't a mistake. It was a bet to buy time and create value. It worked spectacularly as long as storage could paper over allocation. But concrete can't conjure water. It can only shift it in time, and time ran out faster than the contracts assumed. When demand met aridification, the mask slipped. The law of the river, layered over steel and stone, was about to meet the river's new supply. The law of the river, paper water versus wet water. The paperwork looks like order. The river looks like improvisation. Between them sits the law of the river, a century's worth of compacts, statutes, court decrees, contracts, tribal settlements, and a treaty with Mexico, each written to calm one fight at a time. Layer them and you get clarity on paper. Put them on a shrinking river and you get friction. Start with prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. In practice, that means the people who built canals earliest hold senior claims. In the lower basin, that's agriculture, Imperial, Palo Verde, Yuma, metro giants, Phoenix suburbs through the Central Arizona Project, Las Vegas, straw in Mead, Southern California's pipelines, arrived later. They carry junior status even if they carry millions of people. On dry years, juniors take the hit first. On really dry years, everyone argues over what first means. Arizona v. California, the Supreme Court case that formalized lower basin divisions, cemented much of that pecking order. It gave California big, senior slices tied to old projects along the river. The Central Arizona Project, built decades later, was assigned junior priority. In good times, nobody felt the hierarchy. In shortage, it's the script. CAP cuts kick in early. California shields its senior supplies. Paper water becomes a shield. Wet water becomes a weapon. Mexico's share, 1.5 million acre-feet by treaty, sits outside the domestic food fight but lands on the same river. When flows shrink, the United States still owes that delivery at the border. Minutes 319 and 323, a series of binational side deals, created a framework to share shortages and bank conservation in Mead. They also tackled salinity, the hidden blade. When the river slows, salts spike, and fields in Mexicali suffer. Obligations aren't just about volume, they're about quality, and that gets harder as the system tightens. Tribal water rights cut across the whole map. The Winters Doctrine says when the federal government created reservations, it implicitly reserved enough water to fulfill their purpose. Those rights are senior, often earlier than any state project, but for much of the 20th century, they were unquantified and underdeveloped. As settlements move forward, Gila River Indian Community, Navajo Nation agreements, and others, tribes turn paper into power. Sometimes that means building infrastructure to use water on reservation. Sometimes it means leasing to cities, acting as a lender of last resort when junior municipal supplies wobble. Either way, these senior rights move from footnote to fulcrum. The law isn't a single cliff note, it's a stack of IOUs with footnotes. Compact allocations assume a 15 million acre-foot river. Decrees assign priority within that fiction. Contracts move water across mountain ranges and balance sheets. Tribes hold senior claims, unlocking long-delayed justice. Mexico sits downstream with a treaty the United States can't shrug off. Every piece made sense when storage was fat and the 20th century looked wet. None of it erases physics when the supply shrinks. That's where evaporation and system losses, long ignored, forced their way into negotiations. For decades, the lower basin delivered allocations without subtracting what the sun stole from Mead's surface or canals. The new proposals push to count those losses against users, which subtly reorders pain. Upstream, the upper basin delivery obligation to Lee Ferry, 75 million acre-feet over 10 years, looms like a metronome. If warming pulls the baseline lower, meeting that average upstream squeezes their own growth while protecting downstream paper. The accounting begins to break the minute the average disappears. Cities try to buy room with conservation. Las Vegas reuses indoor water and bans ornamental turf. Southern California builds recycling plants, pays for agricultural efficiency transfers, and eyes DeSalle. Phoenix puts lawns on a diet, but keeps approving subdivisions that lean on CAP's junior straw. On paper, these are portfolios. On the river, they're negotiations over who moves first when the next tier triggers. Meanwhile, agriculture leans on senior leverage. Imperial Irrigation District can fallow fields for money, but it doesn't have to. Alfalfa keeps the checkbook stable, and senior status keeps deliveries coming. System conservation deals, paying farmers to leave water in Mead, buy time. They don't erase priority. The minute an emergency fades, the law snaps back to first-in-time habits unless the contracts rewrite it. There's a quiet twist. Paper water can't sue the sky. When flows drop, everyone reaches for language. Surplus, shortage, intentionally created surplus, exchange, lease, transfer. Each term carries a price and a precedent. The Mega-Drought, or aridification if you prefer the truer word, turns those terms from policy into triage. Senior versus junior becomes less about history and more about whether lights stay on and taps run next month. This is the moment everything changes in negotiations. The law of the river used to divide growth. Now it allocates decline. Paper water drew the map. Wet water redraws it. And as the numbers tighten, the fights you thought were about states turn into fights within states, within agencies, within neighborhoods. The statute books don't move fast. The river does. The Mega-Drought data, when average vanishes. To see why the paperwork is wobbling, look at the rings inside old trees. They're ledgers, tight bands for dry years, fat bands for wet. Across the upper basin, dendrochronologists stitched thousands of cores into a 1-200-year timeline. The pattern is blunt. The 20th century, the compact's measuring stick, was one of the wettest stretches on record. The baseline that felt normal was the anomaly. The river's long view sits closer to 11 or 12 million acre-feet, with stretches that sag much lower. Now overlay the 21st century. Starting in 2000, flows slide and rarely bounce. People called it drought, as if normal would return after a few winters. The data says something else: aridification. Warmer air increases vapor pressure deficit, pulling moisture from soil and leaves before it ever becomes runoff. The same snowpack translates to less river because the atmosphere takes a bigger cut. It's not just fewer storms, it's a new math for the ones we get. Runoff timing shifts the ledger further. Spring comes earlier and snow melts fast. In the old pattern, gradual melt lined up with reservoir operations, and managers could catch peak runoff in big buckets. Now warm spells trigger pulses in March and April. By the time release schedules adjust, a chunk of that water has slid past the capture window. The year-end totals don't just shrink, they move around the calendar where concrete can't quite reach them. Evaporation stacks new losses on low lakes. As Mead and Powell fall, surface area changes and shoreline geometry exposes more warm, shallow water. Hotter air and longer ice-free seasons push evaporation rates higher. At the same time, the head that makes electricity drops, compounding a feedback. Less generation per unit of release means more pressure to release water to keep power commitments, which lowers the lakes, which increases evaporation. The numbers don't care about intent. Add the phantom 3 million acre-feet, the overpromise baked into allocation, and you get a structural deficit that appears every year even before a dry winter shows up. Managers have been patching that gap with intentionally created surplus, conservation programs, and accounting transfers, but the tree ring baseline undercuts the idea that average will bail them out. Average, as negotiated in 1922, has vanished. The new center of gravity sits lower, and the tails, multi-year dry spells, run longer. Here's where the science stings. Attribution studies parse how much of the flow decline is temperature-driven versus precipitation. A big chunk is heat. That matters because you can't plan your way out of temperature with more canals. Warming amplifies every other loss: soil moisture deficits, sublimation from snow, plant demand lengthening into shoulders of spring and fall. Even a banner snowfall, like a recent fat winter, looks good in pictures but underperforms in gauges once the sun gets involved. On the ground, the signals are everywhere. Stream gauges that used to surge in May now spike in April. Meadow grasses green up early and brown out sooner. Irrigators push first water orders weeks ahead of old schedules, chasing a season that's sprinting. Managers try to adjust release curves with equalization and protected elevations, but the physics they're chasing isn't linear. The river's hydrograph is flattening and shifting right under the policy terms. Meanwhile, forests that once banked snow under shade are thinning from fire, beetles, and heat stress. Fewer trees in the right places can, in theory, yield more water. In practice, post-fire soils repel water, and floods move sediment instead of clean flow. Burn scars send muddy pulses that clog intakes and fill side canyons that Lake Powell used to occupy. The storage pool shrinks from the bottom with sediment, while the top recedes from heat, tightening usable capacity from both ends. Cities feel the timing shift through treatment plants. Earlier runoff means more turbidity periods coincide with maintenance windows. Power plants feel it through dispatch curves when hydropower goes soft during summer peaks. Farmers feel it when delivery windows miss crop calendars, forcing either deficit irrigation or expensive groundwater pumping. Everyone still talks about annual allocations, but the pain now lands in weeks and days, not just acre-feet. The dataset that exposes the trap isn't just the tree rings, it's the combined ledger: rings, gauges, satellites. Gravity satellites measure groundwater loss across the basin, showing aquifers quietly subsidizing surface shortages. Snow telemetry tells managers the snow water equivalent isn't translating to the old runoff fractions. Reservoir mass balance confirms the slow bleed of evaporation and seepage. Together, they close the books on the myth that storage alone can tame the 21st century river. There's a detail people skip when they say mega-drought. Past mega-droughts happened in a cooler climate. Today's sits on top of warming, which shifts probabilities so that yesterday's worst case edges toward tomorrow's median. That means the policies built for bouncing between wet and dry need to shift to surviving in dry with occasional wet relief. Relief years aren't recovery, they're chances to avoid hitting critical thresholds. So the story tightens. The law of the river assumes a generous mean. The engineered empire depends on catching melt and selling head. The climate is moving the goalposts while lowering the field. The result is a permanent shortfall that can't be erased with one wet season or one deal. Deficit spending in water looked like growth, while the lakes buffered reality. Without that buffer, the math turns into a spiral unless demand steps down to the new river. Lake Mead, Lake Powell, the disappearing balance sheet. Managers used to talk about tiers in quiet meetings.